many of you will have noticed that my accent is far from Canadian or North American. I come from South Africa, and that's somewhat relevant because I was educated in apartheid South Africa. It was a kind of strange education at the English language universities, including the one I went to in Johannesburg, in the political science departments, and I majored in political science. The debates were all between Marxists. The political science departments were stocked with Marxists under this deeply authoritarian regime. And at that point, I thought that the only debate in political theory was between Althusser and the Frankfurt School. I have learned a little bit more about political theory since then, and also about law. And another thing that I learned growing up in apartheid South Africa and being educated in apartheid South Africa was a deep respect for legality. And as I've tried to find out more about what this idea means, legality, I've become convinced, which is maybe why I'm at this conference at all, that it's completely inconsistent with any claim about constituent power. I came to realize this when I came to Germany in the early 1990s to work on Weimar legal theory. At that point, Carl Schmitt was unknown in the English-speaking world. There were a few apologists in the United States who were writing about Schmitt, but otherwise Schmitt was not a known name. Now everyone knows about Schmitt. I worked not only on Schmitt, but also on Hans Kelsen and Hermann Heller. And I was thinking about these folk as I was walking here. I got off my train, I stopped too early, so I had to walk a bit to get here. And I walked over for the first time, I think in Berlin, the Hugo Preuss Bridge. Now, many of you will know that Hugo Preuss is commonly thought of as the father of the Weimar Constitution. And this is a point I want to make in response to some of the things that Ademi has said today. I don't think, if we go back, I think it's to Ademi's second last slide, where you talked about, I think, hidden monarchy, right? And this was somehow tied to the idea of the demonic, which I think you think is also part and parcel of constituent power. I don't think for someone like Hugo Preuss that monarchy was at all hidden in the Weimar Constitution. Preuss had been engaged in debates with Max Weber about how to design this constitution, and Weber was largely responsible, as I recall, for introducing into the Weimar Constitution Article 48, which was meant to be a kind of residue of monarchical power. But Preuss and the other designers of the Constitution thought that if one had the right kind of constitution in place, one could discipline that residue of monarchical power. Were they wrong? Well, one might think that the history of the Weimar Republic proves that they were wrong. But one should recall that after the Second World War, I think it was Adenauer who said that the problem with the Weimar Constitution had nothing to do with the Constitution itself, it had to do with the lack of democrats. And I was very struck, Ademi, by your talk about a propaganda of civic virtue, because that's clearly something that's necessary in order to sustain constitutionalism. Now, if we continue with Mr. Hobbes, my favorite political theorist, what we have here, if you can read it against this rather bad green background now that I see it blown up, this is a famous sentence from Hobbes's Leviathan, where he gives one the oath that goes into the social contract. And it seems to be a moment of constituent power in Leviathan. Everyone gets together and they grant authority to the sovereign who's going to be their representative, the bearer of the people. So Hobbes does seem, in some sense, to be a theorist of constituent power. But if we move on in Hobbes, in fact, right to the end of his great book, Leviathan, we find that Hobbes says that it's a grave mistake to look back at the beginnings of any state to find out why it's legitimate or justified. Why? Because every state is born in violence and war and death. So don't look to the origins of any state if you want to find out why the state is legitimate. And interestingly, we find the same thought echoed later in Kant. So what seems to happen in Leviathan is that this constituent moment in the social contract vanishes once civil society is up and running. And the same thing seems to happen to the laws of nature. Now, I'm not going to have enough time to talk about the laws of nature, but I think Hobbes's conception of the laws of nature is very different from the conceptions of the laws of nature that we've heard Odomy refer to at various points today. For Hobbes, the laws of nature, I think, have nothing to do with nature. What the laws of nature are for Hobbes are the kind of internal grammar of a legal order, and that is something that's completely artificial. It's constructed by people, and the laws of nature are his attempt to try to understand what gives structure to a legal order and a political order when it manifests itself through a legal order. But the problem with the laws of nature is that for many commentators on Hobbes, in fact for most, they suppose that the laws of nature vanish along with the social contract. And we find this thought beautifully expressed in the Italian political and legal philosopher, on whom I've actually spent most of the last year working, Norberto Bobbio. In his essays on Hobbes, Bobbio says that the true function of Hobbes's extensive account of the laws of nature, and that the only one that cannot be eliminated, is to provide the most absolute ground to the norm, according to which there is no other valid law than positive law. So it seems that both the social contract and the laws of nature vanish from civil society once civil society is up and running, and all the laws of nature do, all the work that they do, is to supply a justification for complete obedience to the law of the sovereign, whatever the content of that law. This is what I call the orthodox view of Hobbes, and one finds this view not only in Hobbes scholars like Bobbio, but also in the work of Bernard Williams. And Williams's work, in particular his political realism, is work that I much admire. And he starts probably his most famous essay in political philosophy by saying that political theory should start with the Hobbesian question of how to secure order, protection, safety, trust, and the conditions of cooperation. This, Williams says, is the first political question, because solving it is the condition of solving, indeed posing any others. And I completely agree with that, just as a true statement, but also as a statement about Hobbes. And I think, I'm not quite sure whether this is what you were saying right at the beginning, Odomy, but if it is what you were saying, not in your panel, but when you introduced your center to us, I thought that one of the things that you said is that scholars in the West seem to despair about the future in a way that perhaps people who come from backgrounds where they've experienced state authoritarianism do not, which is interesting, right? And I think as I said, grew up in apartheid South Africa. Even though I was in the privileged white minority, it was still a very authoritarian society. And yet there was a kind of sense of optimism there, that things could be better if only we could design society in a better fashion. And that's a sense of optimism that comes about through seeing what an absence of appropriate order delivers to us, and the promise of rebuilding order in a way that would make life better for everyone. Now, Williams continues in this essay that just because this question is the first question, the first political question, one should not think that the question once solved never has to be solved again, because a solution to the first political question, he says, is required all the time. And he thinks that Hobbes is mistaken, that Hobbes thinks all one needs is a one-off solution. One just creates the state and the sovereign, and from then on, you don't have to ask the first political question again. And in making that claim, I think that Williams subscribes to the orthodox view of Hobbes, to which Bobbio also subscribes, and it's that view which I now want to try to debunk. So what does this orthodox view of Hobbes fail to notice? What it fails to notice is something interesting about the social contract, which mid-20th century historians of political thought knew well. So in early modern political thought, the social contract was conceived as two closely connected, though distinguishable ideas, both of which were required to make up a complete contract. The Gesellschaftsvertrag, or contract of the whole of the society to be ruled by one sovereign, and the Herrschaftsvertrag, which, as Ernest Barker, a very distinguished historian of ideas, put it, in the sense of government, is based on a contract between ruler and subjects. But then Barker notes, I think quite correctly, that with Hobbes, once the political community is formed, there is no further contract between the sovereign Leviathan and the community, so that the state is subject to none of the limits of a contract of government. And there, I think Barker is wrong. And he, in fact, noticed that there was a problem in attributing this interpretation to Hobbes. He says, on the other hand, we have to notice that in the theory of Hobbes, every subject covenants with every other in one and the same act to form a society and to obey a government, and a subject will therefore break a sort of contract with the government, not with the ruler, but with other subjects if he refuses to obey, and that in the theory of Hobbes, the ruler is bound to give protection to the lives of his subjects, and if he fails to do so, they may rebel. So after all, there is an implicit contract between rulers and subjects, which the ruler may himself break. I don't think that there is an implicit contract. I think there is an explicit contract. And it comes about because for Hobbes, the sovereign is someone who rules through legal order. What does it mean to rule through legal order? I think what it means is that one puts in place what I call two provisos. And the first proviso, the validity proviso, is that it is a necessary but not sufficient condition of the sovereign's authority that when it exercises that authority, it does so in a way that complies with the public criteria recognized by its audience for certifying that a law is valid. And I didn't have time earlier to read through the new Constitution, which Ardemi and others have devised. I just had a quick look at it at the internet because I wanted to listen to what you were saying, and I wasn't quite sure whether you had such public criteria set out in your new Constitution, but I suspected that there is, just because there is a lot of talk about law and legality, and I don't think one can have either law or legality unless there are public criteria for determining what counts as legal. The second proviso is the legality proviso, that the laws of the sovereign must be interpreted, and so must be interpretable in light of the laws of nature. And the idea of interpretability falls out of Hobbes's account of the role of judicial interpretation, which is something that most Hobbes scholars neglect through failing to read chapter 26 of Leviathan. Hobbes begins that account by saying that before validly enacted laws become binding, there is another very material condition that must be met. The laws must be given an authentic interpretation, a condition necessary because all laws, written and unwritten, have need of interpretation. An authentic interpretation for Hobbes is a reasonable interpretation, that is one that can be justified with reasons that make sense to legal subjects of their subjection. And that puts in place what I call in this book Hobbes's constitutionalist idea. On the one hand, there's a Herrschaftsvertrag, or governmental contract, in the form of an ongoing practice which constitutes the authority of the modern legal state. On the other hand, that practice presupposes a Gesellschaftsvertrag, or societal contract made by individuals in the state of nature. Put differently, and this is the important point, Hobbes makes the crucial move in developing a social contract theory for the modern legal state by turning the Herrschaftsvertrag into a juridical relationship between ruler and ruled, one mediated by a dynamic process of application of the law in which the officials answer the legal subject's question, but how can that be law for me? And if one accepts this as an understanding of legality, which is the argument of this rather long book, then one can do entirely without the idea of constituent power. And in preparation for today, I did a search of the PDF version of the book, and I found out, maybe this shows nothing, maybe it shows why it's not worth reading this book, that I mentioned constituent power just once and in passing. So at least I've tried to develop a theory of legality relying on these three great jurists, Hobbes, Kelsen, and Hart, without referring to the idea of constituent power. Now, I probably would have put up the cover of my book anyway, just in the hopes of marketing it to you. But it actually occurred to me that there was another reason for putting it up, and that is the cover, which you can't really see very well there, so I've tried to blow up a portion of it. It's a painting by George Gross, and the painting is entitled Friedrichstrasse, so kind of just around the corner. And what you have there is a multitude, and then the problem is, how do you create a unity out of that multitude? For Hobbes, one creates that unity by designing a political order which is largely expressed through a legal order. And I think he can do all of that without any idea of constituent power. And it seems to me, and this is going to be my closing remark, that in the debates that we might have about constituent power versus something like constituent authority, at stake are two theories of authority, one linear and one circular. And these are ideas that are not original to me. The place where I get them from is in very small print at the bottom. A friend of mine in Canada, Mark Walters, and Walters sets out the distinction between linear theories and circular theories as follows. He says that linear theories assume that the authority of legal norms can be traced back along a line of increasingly higher norms until an originating source is located. Law from this perspective is held up by a string, and someone or something must hold the end of that string, and from that you get a problem of infinite regress. If you want to know who a linear theorist is, maybe the linear theorist, someone who's already been mentioned today and will surely be mentioned again, that's Carl Schmitt. In contrast, there's circular theories of authority, which Walters claims, I think rightly, do not need to address the problem of infinite regress. What is a circular theory? Law from this perspective is embedded within a network of interlocking strands of normative value that bend back upon themselves, never reaching an end. The relevant image on this account is not a string, but a web of strings shaped into a globe or sphere. Thank you very much.
I will start by a comment immediately because you mentioned me. First of all, like this last point was very appealing, and there is this infinity in a good constitutional law, potentially like what Harrington says, like Commonwealth for growth. I mentioned that a good federation should be in principle an infinite replication of the same model. But of course, well, there is a question where this all ends eventually, so it's up for history. But at the same time, in terms of Hobbes, yes, natural law doesn't have anything to do with nature, but for a good reason, because there is a contradiction in Hobbes between right of nature and law of nature. And I think that this is a dialectical element. Natural law in Hobbes is already a law going against itself, so to say. So law against right. Because none of this would make sense without the state of nature and a certain law that strangely is present there, law of violence. But Hobbes has on the cover of his page the quotation from Job that there is nothing on this earth that can compare to this power. And if you look further into the book of Job, it's clear that the Leviathan, God rather, speaking about the Leviathan, says that there is no covenant. You cannot enter a covenant with the beast. So that's the traditional interpretation. The traditional interpretation that Hobbes emphasizes that you don't make any contract with the Leviathan. So that could go a little bit against your argument.
Yeah, so it goes against the grain for me to say anything nice about Carl Schmitt. But still, there was something to his, I think, 1938 book, where he argues that Hobbes tries to show how the Leviathan can be tamed through erecting this rational legal apparatus so that now the machine runs itself, and then the culmination is Kelsen. And Schmidt thought that was a mistake for Hobbes to do this. I actually think it was exactly the right thing to do, and that, as I understood things from your last slide, you want in your constitution, and I'm sure it draws on that document you told us about, you want to establish a kind of dynamic constitution that can reinvent itself along the way to deal with changing conditions through putting in place the right kinds of institutions that will make this possible.
Yeah, the Jeffersonian thing that it kind of renews itself.
And the only point where I thought I might disagree with you is when a question came from the audience about what do you think about the Chilean attempt at creating a new constitution, and you said, well, perhaps that constitution was more about rights than institutions. I wouldn't actually make that dichotomy. I think that rights and institutions are all part of the same project, and that rights can be remade through having the right kind of institutions in place, and also we can design our institutions better in order to live up to our changing conception of rights. But I think that one can develop a concept of constitutionalism that's capacious enough to contain within itself the creative power necessary to do that, without supposing that there's something demonic outside that's just waiting to break through, or underneath, whether it's on top or underneath, waiting to break through. I mean, this is the hope of liberal constitutionalism, and maybe I'm with the young Marx when it comes to these things.
Great, thank you.
Yes, David, very quickly, I have two questions. The first is, I would not disagree with you that, with your claim that legality does not need the constituent power. But my question is, what about democratic legality? Does democratic legality need constituent power and popular sovereignty? Because what will be the origins of legality in a democracy? So my question is about democratic legality. What Hobbes can tell us about that? The second is, do you think that in the other treaties on the citizen, that's where Hobbes there develops the idea of democracy as a generic regime, that it's the primary assembly that creates political institutions, political authority in every case. Do you see there maybe an element of constituent power? Because there he does not distinguish between the multitude and the people. In the Leviathan, he argues that the multitude is disorganized and, of course, violent and conflicting, and the people is the result of representation. And, of course, representation is an instituted or constituted principle. But in the citizen, he does not have this distinction yet. So he accords to the original multitude a collective power to create political orders. So there do you think, and then he gives up with the Leviathan. So how do you interpret these earlier discussions about the origins of political power in Hobbes?
I think that the way to understand, or the way to answer your question is to see that there is actually quite a radical jump that Hobbes makes from on the citizen to Leviathan. And that radical jump comes in one of the shortest chapters of Leviathan, which I think is chapter 16, where he sets out his idea of the artificial nature of the state. That idea he did not yet have in De Kive. And it's that idea that I think allows him to leave behind the sense that the multitude has to kind of get together in a room and have a vote about what kind of a state they're going to have. But it's still, there is still this kind of democratic dimension to Hobbes's thought in Leviathan, because the idea that each individual owns the state authority, and that the state authority exists because of the consent of each individual to that authority, that is intrinsically a democratic idea, I think. You look very skeptical.
Very skeptical because it's a theory of consent.
Yeah.
And usually these theories of consent come from monarchical theories when the king requires a kind of popular consent. In democracy, the idea is not consent, it's action. That the subject of the law is the author of the law. It's not that the subject of the law consents to be a subject to the law, but that will take us to a different direction.
Sure.
Yes,
Michael
my question actually has to do with this precise point, because I wonder why you don't refer to Hobbes himself on the question of authority. In the Leviathan, Hobbes says that it's as if I am the author of the sovereign's actions. I recognize myself having delegated my limited power to the sovereign. I recognize myself in that action, and I authorize it insofar as I recognize my own authorship in the actions of the sovereign. So it has nothing to do with legal norms. I see this as completely foreign to Hobbes himself. And in this, I'm absolutely with Schmidt. Norms do not have an authority. The legal norms do not have an authority in the sense in which Schmidt uses the term authority, because norms themselves are neither authors nor authorizations in this subjective sense in which Hobbes uses the term. So I wonder really why move to these theories of authority that stand opposed to the letter of Hobbes's text.
Well, Hobbes himself, I think, would have disagreed with you that his theory of authority, which is in I think it is chapter 16 of Leviathan, is inconsistent with my claims about his views about legal order. Why? Because when he moves on from chapter 26, from chapter 16 through to actually setting out his understanding of the modern state, in which chapter 26, the chapter on civil law, is, I think, the central element, followed by the chapters on crime and punishment. There, he's trying to conceptualize the institutional arrangements which are necessary to put in place in order to make it plausible to legal subjects that they should suppose that they have authorized the sovereign in the way that he claims earlier in the book. So the authorization and the continued consent are made possible through designing a political order which is in large part a legal order, and where law mediates between the sovereign and the subject. And that's why I had on the earlier slide this question, which I argue in my book, should be the central question of philosophy of law, but how can that be law for me? Because for Hobbes, I think it's very important that the way that the state works be able to supply an adequate answer to that question, so that the subject doesn't suppose that the relationship of protection and obedience between the sovereign, which Hobbes says right at the end of Leviathan is the whole design of the book to show, that relationship isn't ruptured. For Hobbes, there's no right to revolution. Why? Because I think he supposes that if one designs society in the right kind of way, one needn't get to the revolutionary moment.
Hi, Professor Dyzenhaus. Thank you for the presentation. I wanted to understand that in law as as a circular authority, do you see legality existing in like a plurilegal order sense? Because I think a lot of your work, especially around emergencies, comes most sharply in areas of contested or conflicted democracies in post-colonies. And there you have questions of jurisdictions themselves where communities which do not have been given the space of nationhood or all, they're contesting a jurisdiction that another state is imposing on them. And we also see that this in the context of indigenous community orders and state orders, that there is increasingly a claim of plural legality or plural legal orders and legality to be framed through that. So do you see a circular framing can be placed in that sort of understanding of law?
Yes, I think so for most of the examples that you mentioned, with one exception. So I've been teaching a course in various places called The Politics of Legal Space. And this is based on chapter 5 of this book, and that I had up a while ago. And in this course, I deal with lawyering in very difficult circumstances. So in Nazi Germany, in apartheid South Africa, in the occupied territories, in pre-Civil War US. But then in Toronto, where this is appropriate, I've tried to talk about, so I think that in all of those contexts, difficult as it is, one can show that legality can work in this kind of circular way. Where it doesn't work is with indigenous legal orders. So indigenous legal orders, I think, pose the biggest problem for my conception of legality. It just doesn't fit, and it kind of disturbs the whole structure. It disturbs it in very interesting ways, and ways that I want to explore in future work, but I have no answer for where I would go with trying to deliver an answer to the question, well, what about indigenous orders? I think all sorts of legal plurality can be accommodated, but not that one.
Can you say why? What is the challenge?
Well, what is the challenge? The challenge is there's a kind of incommensurability between the worldview that's presupposed in what I call the modern legal state, which I think can accommodate a lot of challenges from colonial struggles and so on. But I think the worldview in the indigenous orders with which I'm somewhat familiar through living in Canada is so different that it's very difficult to accommodate, and even the attempted accommodation leads to assimilation rather than recognition. So it's a highly problematic process. In fact, the person I have at the bottom there, Mark Walters, has written beautifully about this kind of problem in Canada.
Maybe the last question there. We'll have to move on.
Yeah, thanks. I hope I have another problem for the legalist strategy. And I agree with the legalist reading of Hobbes, I should say in advance, but I disagree with the rehabilitation of the medieval category of the Herrschaftsvertrag, because the Herrschaftsvertrag, even if turned, as you propose to do, into juridical relations between government and governed, makes it impossible for the governed to get rid of the power holders as long as they do not violate the juridical conditions under which their right to rule has been established. And so, for example, the UK could never get rid of the king in the legislative as long as the juridical conditions were not violated. And so this is a major disadvantage of any legal theory that does not have a notion of constituent power, because what we want to say is that for democratic reasons we can send the king into the desert if we wish to do so, and not because the king has violated juridical conditions under which we owe obedience to him.
I'm not sure whether the UK presents a good counterexample to me, because the king has this kind of very ceremonial role in the United Kingdom. The king is incapable of disturbing the constitutional order in the United Kingdom. Getting rid of the king is something that could be done constitutionally, but it's not that King Charles can suddenly become the new Trump. He's for the most part, constitutionally irrelevant. I think there's a much greater problem in the United States as a counterexample. I was thinking, I can't remember why, earlier today, I think it was probably again sparked by something that Artemis said, that the famous mathematician Gödel, when he was in the United States, at one point he decides that he's going to become an American citizen. So being a kind of a very nerdy guy, he spends a lot of time working on American constitutional law, and then Einstein and someone else take Gödel along for his citizenship test. And Gödel's in a complete state because he's discovered that you can subvert the US Constitution from within. And then he asks the person who's giving him the test, well, you know, something like, how can I swear allegiance to this Constitution when you can destroy it from within? So I think the US is probably a greater problem for me than the UK.
It's surprising that no one has ever done this.
Yeah.
Maybe Roosevelt was the only one.
Well, we may see it happen in a few weeks.
Exactly,
Yeah, okay.
exactly.